Hello. So I wrote down a couple thoughts. So they'll be more concise and I won't ramble as much. So I wanted to spend a little time here to talk about the last two readings of the week. The first is The Uses of the Erotic by Audre Lorde, and the second is the poem Transcendental Etude by Adrienne Rich. I paired these two readings together because I actually think they have a lot in common. So not only were Rich and Lorde friends, both were also poets, self-proclaimed lesbian feminists, and they were also pivotal figures in the feminist movement of their time, what is now typically called second wave feminism. The reason I included these two readings along with the article by Sharon Krauss and the readings on systemic racism is because both Lorde and Rich were also very much concerned with what we've been calling structural forms of oppression. So that is, they both feel confined and limited by the patriarchal norms that have been imposed on women. The argument that Lorde makes is that women have been conditioned to suppress their own erotic desires, and as a result, they have been cut off from a source of their power and have become limited in the kinds of pleasures that they are capable of enjoying. So similarly, Rich is troubled by the fact that the only language she has recourse to when communicating with others, and specifically she's concerned with women, is a language that has been created by men and for men. And so as a result, she thinks that her language is better suited to expressing the experiences, priorities, and desires of men more so than those of women. So part of Rich's project is reconciling the fact, to use her words, that this is the oppressor's language, yet I need it to talk to you. To contextualize this in relation to the readings by Sharon Krauss, we can say that both Rich and Lorde seem to be trying to reclaim their agency from the oppressive forces of a male-dominated society. And these forces aren't intentional, nor are they under any single individual's control. So they're not what we've been calling sovereign. They're non-sovereign in nature. And rather, they work on a societal level in the forms of hidden biases or stigma. So they're socially distributed. For instance, in the case of Lorde, there might be a stigma associated with the expression of eroticism in women. And eroticism for her is a feeling that's closely associated with joy. More specifically, it's a kind of joy that comes from sharing something deeply, and this sharing can be physical, intellectual, or emotional in nature. And it's also a joy that connects a person to themselves, to their capacity for feeling. And the only socially acceptable way for women to express the erotic in a patriarchal society, Lorde argues, is in the form of sex with men. So as Lorde argues, the reason why it might be unacceptable for women to pursue the erotic in non-sexual activity is because such an activity wouldn't be for the sake of a man's pleasure. And it would also mean that women would now be able to seek and attain spiritual and emotional fulfillment on their own without requiring a man to first validate that, and without it having to conform with the norms and expectations of men. And it's important to note that for Lorde, the erotic is conceived as the opposite of the pornographic. So the pornographic is mere sensation. It has no depth, no resonance. It's a fleeting pleasure. And the erotic, on the other hand, is closely associated with the drive for perfection and excellence. So when you feel it, you begin to want to aspire to it. And I think she's also maybe saying that you feel it most intensely when you're doing something really, really well. And it's in this way that it's associated with perfection. Because when you do something excellently, you feel the erotic, which in turn makes you want to act excellently in the future. And Lorde argues that this aspect of the erotic points to another reason why it has been vilified by men. So in her words, and I'm just roughly quoting, once women know what they're capable of, they'll begin to demand more from life, and they'll demand that their pursuits align with their feelings and their passions. And because of this, they'll be less likely to be complacent with their subsidiary role in society. And just a quick point. So when she talks about the erotic, it actually reminds me a lot of Aristotle, of all people, strangely. But because Aristotle thought the same thing. He didn't obviously use the word the erotic, but he thought that like being a good person should be intensely pleasurable. And it's this very specific kind of pleasure, what he called eudaimonia. So if you remember from the first week of class. So he thought that like when we became like really excellent people, one of the signs of being excellent was the fact that you experience this activity of being a good person as being immensely pleasurable. So it was very like self-fulfilling. It was intrinsically motivating to be a good person because of just how it felt. Rich is kind of making a similar argument there, which I think is interesting. Lord is making a similar argument. I mean, okay. So now we're going to move on to Rich. And I want to just point out at first that Rich is making similar points to Lord, only she's talking about language. So Rich thinks that the language which we speak, all of us in our society, and the words we use, the way we use these words to make sense of our world, that all this has been shaped by the values and experiences of men. So for instance, in the third and fourth stanzas, she compares learning the male language to the difficulty of learning how to read music. And she writes, quote, "We aren't ready for it. Nothing that was said is true for..." Sorry, let me start again. "We aren't ready for it. Nothing that was said is true for us. Caught naked in the argument, the counterpoint, trying to sight read what our fingers can't keep up with, learned by heart what we can't even read, and yet it is this we were born to." And so the us she's referring to here is obviously women. And I think the experience she's referring to is that of being thrown into a man's world and having to struggle to conform oneself to it, and struggling because the language one has to learn isn't one that speaks to the experiences of women. It's not one that resonates with them. And now if we move on to fifth stanza, Rich continues with the analogy between learning a language and learning how to read music. But here she gets more specific and starts to identify specific things about the male language which she finds alienating. For instance, she writes, "And we're not performers, like Liszt's, competing against the world for speed and brilliance." The 79-year-old pianist said when I asked her, "What makes a virtuoso?" "Competitiveness." And one thing that's interesting here is that she indirectly identifies the learning of a male language as a performance. And in a performance, of course, the actor is pretending to be someone other than who they really are. And then she identifies competitiveness as one of the traits that makes for an excellent musician. And I think here she might be implying that competitiveness is a characteristically male standard, a male value, and that women who try to excel in a man's world, who's trying to speak a man's language, might try to conform to this standard of competitiveness. And yet this attempt to play by men's rules is alienating for women and doesn't feel authentic, and it's only ever a performance and not a true expression of oneself. And we can see this confirmed in her next lines. And she writes, quote, "The longer I live, the more I mistrust the theatricality, the false glamour cast by performance. The more I know it's poverty beside the truths that we are salvaging from the splitting open of our lives." And here she makes the contrast between, quote, "the false glamour of the performance and the truths that one salvages from one's innermost self." So there are things that women know to be true, but these truths can't be expressed in a man's language. And in the course of the performance where women have to behave according to male standards, these innermost truths have to be set aside. They have to go unexpressed and unacknowledged. Okay. And now I just want to go over a couple of the stanzas that I really liked. I don't want to do all of it because I want to give you guys a chance to read it on your own and come to your own conclusions. But yeah, so the very next stanza, I think it's the fifth stanza. I really like that one too, because she talks about the experience of trying to cut ties with your language, and she thinks this is this is an essential step in the process of coming to a new language, which is her ultimate aim. But she talks here in the fifth stanza, "There comes a time when we have to pull back from the incantations, rhythms we've moved to thoughtlessly, and disenthrall ourselves, bestow ourselves to silence, or to a deeper listening, cleansed of oratory, formulas, choruses, laments, static crowding of the wires. We cut the wires, find ourselves in free fall, as if our true home were the unidimensional solitudes, the rift in the great nebula. No one who survives to speak a new language has avoided this, the cutting away from an old force that held her rooted to an old ground, the pitch of utter loneliness where she herself and all creation seem equally dispersed, weightless, her being a cry to which no echo comes or can ever come. So a lot of interesting things are happening here. So notice this is the first time she uses her. So now she's like explicitly identifying herself as a or identifying this as a female experience. Whereas in the beginning it was kind of unclear to whom she was speaking to and from and what kind of person she was speaking as. So it's an interesting transition throughout the poem where in the beginning she's not using any explicit gender pronouns, but then she starts referring to us, and then it becomes like, well, who's this us? And then she starts identifying her like this as being a uniquely and distinctly female experience when she starts using the pronoun her. And then it becomes apparent that she's talking as a woman to other women, which is also kind of awkward that I'm like here in the middle of like trying to explain this poem that's written by a woman to other women. And so I know that there's like something strange about this, but let's not pay attention to that. So yeah, so she's speaking of this like uniquely female experience where they have to sort of cut ties with the language that grounded them. And she talks about like this cutting of ties as like almost a very disorienting experience, and like a losing or not being a losing of a home. And so that's also kind of an interesting point that I want you guys to focus on, the way that like our language is kind of like our home for us. And it's a point that several philosophers have made in the past, specifically Heidegger, who like thinks that language is our home, and it's like the way that we experience the world is always mediated through our language. And so whenever we feel at home in the world, it's because we feel at home in our language. It's kind of an interesting, yeah. So like that all experiences are mediated through language. There's no such thing as having having any kind of experience if it's not understood through the language that we've inherited. And so this is why it's like such an existential crisis for Adrienne Rich to have like to only have access to this male language, because that means that your world is the world that's kind of shaped by these patriarchal forces. So this is why it's so important for her to like come up with a new language, because without a new language, then you're limited in your experiences. If you can only see the world through like the prism of like male experience, and then as a woman you're incredibly limited in how much you have access to your own self and your own experiences. So for women, her argument seems to be that like, you know, you never really like they never really had a home to begin with, because their language was always a male language. So I think that's an interesting point that she's making, and I especially love these lines and these metaphors. We cut the wires, find ourselves in free fall. Very, very interesting imagery there. This sort of like sense of disorientation when you finally make that decision to like start new and not have to rely anymore on this sort of like male language. And so the last point I want to make is just at the very end of the poem, because I think it ties really well with the piece by Audre Lorde. So this last stanza, she this is such a beautiful stanza, by the way. She starts the stanza by saying, vision begins to happen in such a life, as if a woman quietly walked away from the argument and jargon in a room, and sitting down in the kitchen began turning in her lap bits of yarn, calico and velvet scraps, laying them out absently on the scrubbed boards in the lamplight, with small rainbow-colored shells sent in cotton wool from somewhere far away, and skeins of milkweed from the nearest meadow, original domestic silk, the finest findings, and the dark blue petal of the petunia, and dry dark brown lace of seaweed. Not forgotten either, the shed silver whisker of the cat, the spiral paper wasp net curling beside the finch's yellow feather. And so what's interesting there is that like she talks about this, you know, so for her that decision to sort of break sort of break away and cut ties with the male language, takes a very sort of like a physical dimension here. She's literally walking away from an argument and literally walking away from like this scene and this conversation and this jargon in this room. And she starts, like the protagonist in this poem begins to occupy herself with a very physical task, which is like sewing. And this reminds me of what Audre Lorde was saying about the erotic. The erotic is always found in this physical activity that you're engaged in, and in the way that she's talking about this activity of sewing and like all the different components that go into it, the different materials that are being worked on and where these materials are coming from and their textures and their colors. She's using very erotic language to talk about this. And she's and it shows that she's deriving so much pleasure from this activity of sewing and how it's immensely fulfilling and so much superior to the jargon in the jargon and the arguments that were in that room that she walked away from. And then she's starting to talk about this activity of sewing, and that the activity of sewing starts to take on this sort of metaphorical dimension. So she says, the striving for greatness, brilliance, only with the musing of a mind, one with the body, experienced fingers quietly pushing dark against bright, silk against roughness, pulling the tenets of a life together, with no mere will to mastery, only care for the many-lived, unending forms in which she finds herself. So that's interesting because she's like, there's this image of uniting things and pulling things together, whereas before the imagery was of dispersal and of disconnects and of like falling away and the ground beneath you kind of falling beneath your feet. So there were all these images of like things coming apart, whereas now at the end there's this imagery of bringing things together and uniting things and like tying things up. And so the dispersal earlier, the imagery of dispersal, had to do with losing of a language. And here she's kind of like creating a language for herself through this activity of sewing, which brings like immense pleasure that could be erotic. And this is kind of like the solution. So it's also interesting that like the way that she comes to an answer to her question. It's like, what do we do about this situation we're in, where we can't speak to each other because we only have recourse to a male language? The way she comes to an answer to that question is by talking about what has characteristically been an activity that's been associated with women, which is sewing. So it's interesting because like sewing is usually it's equated with something that like implies like domesticity and subordination. So women, instead of working and being in like these male spheres, like business and entrepreneurship and activities that are associated with like success, instead of that being the solution, she instead focuses on something that's traditionally been reserved for women and traditionally been associated with like subordination. But at the same time, I also see this as like a way of like reclaiming something. It's like she's reclaiming this activity for herself, and instead of giving it significance that would have been assigned to it by men, sort of like men are the ones who have assigned these activities a lesser value. So she's reclaiming it for herself and assigning it a meaning that is uniquely her own. So so I see this as like a way of like reclaiming this activity for herself as a woman's activity, but also giving it a significance that goes beyond what men have traditionally assigned this activity. So I mean, some things to think about. It's interesting here at the end when this imagery of the rock shelf. And she says, and now the stone foundation, rock shelf, further forming underneath everything that grows. It's interesting because that image of a rock shelf occurs earlier in the poem, in the second stanza, but it occurs in a totally different light and has a totally different meaning. She writes, "A lifetime is too narrow to understand it all, beginning with the huge rock shells that underlie all that life." So the rock shelf in the beginning takes on this, it's almost like this sort of insurmountable obstacle, and it stands in the way of understanding. And she uses it to sort of connote this sort of helplessness that she feels. Whereas the rock shelf in the end has something to do with it's like an image of empowerment, actually. So it's a rock shelf that's further forming underneath everything that grows. So it's a sign of empowerment, and it's something that like is growing, and it's like so yeah, it's interesting how that image changes from the beginning to the end. And I won't say anything more about it because I want you guys to think about it on your own and like come to your own conclusions as to what it means, because it seems to be a very important image for her. And it also occurs in other poems in this collection. Yeah. So yeah, I want you to think about this poem, and like specifically like how she talks about like the relationships between women. And that occurs in the 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So 7th, 8th, 9th stanzas. She talks specifically about like about relationships with other women, and how these relationships are the ones that she's concerned about, and like also they're how she's modeling this new language. It's like these are the relationships that she wants to model this new language on. And also she talks a lot about how poetry is a solution to this problem, how poetry can give us a new language and be and create for us a new world that is sort of more suited to expressing female experiences and more suited to relationships between women, where there can be more of a sense of intimacy and understanding. Okay, I want to say more, but I won't say anything else. I'll let you guys read it on your own and like have your own interpretations as well. Okay, that's all I wanted to say. But yeah, I think some things that you can think about for Monday is just like look for some of the connections between this piece and the Audre Lorde piece, because I think that there are a lot of different connections you can be making here. But I probably already said too much. But yeah, it's a great piece. I hope you guys enjoy it, and I'll see you on Monday.